Hello everyone, and welcome back. Today, I invite you to slow down for a moment, to step away from noise, pressure, and expectations, and simply listen. In this story, you will not only learn English, you will walk through a journey of failure, doubt, growth, and quiet transformation. It is a story about the moments when life doesn't go as planned, when effort seems meaningless, and when repeated setbacks begin to make us question who we really are. But sometimes, failure is not the end of the road. Sometimes it is life patiently teaching us something we were not ready to understand before. So find a comfortable place, relax your mind, and let the story guide you. Listen carefully, feel the emotions, and allow English to come naturally through storytelling. Let's begin. For most of my early life, I believed that success followed a clear and predictable formula. I was convinced that if a person worked hard enough, remained disciplined, and stayed committed to the correct path, life would naturally reward that effort sooner or later. To me, achievement seemed logical and fair, almost mathematical in nature. Those who succeeded must have earned it through persistence, while failure, I assumed, belonged to people who lacked focus, talent, or determination. I never once imagined that failure would eventually become one of the most influential teachers in my life, shaping not only my career but also my understanding of myself. I moved through life with an unshakable confidence about the future waiting ahead of me. I carried ambitious ideas and an intense desire to prove that I could build something meaningful on my own terms. Independence felt essential to my identity, and starting my first business seemed less like a gamble and more like the natural beginning of success. I rented a modest office, furnished mostly with second-hand desks and chairs, convinced that passion mattered more than appearance. Late nights were spent designing my website, planning strategies, and imagining growth that felt certain rather than hopeful. I proudly handed out business cards to anyone willing to listen, speaking about my vision with enthusiasm that left little room for doubt at the beginning. Excitement covered every uncertainty. Each small victory, a new client, a positive email, or even a promising conversation, felt like confirmation that success was inevitable. I interpreted early progress as proof that determination alone would carry me forward. However, reality rarely announces its arrival loudly. Instead, it revealed itself slowly through subtle warning signs I chose not to notice. Clients hesitated before committing. Payments arrived later than expected. Expenses quietly multiplied while opportunities failed to grow at the same pace. The long working hours that once felt energizing gradually replaced enthusiasm with exhaustion. Within months, optimism gave way to constant anxiety. Evenings often ended with me sitting alone in the office, staring at my computer screen while repeatedly refreshing my inbox, hoping for inquiries or confirmations that never came. The silence felt oppressive, heavier than outright rejection, because it offered no explanation and no closure. Sleep became restless, and confidence slowly eroded under the weight of uncertainty. When the business finally collapsed, the loss extended far beyond finances. It struck deeply at my sense of identity. I questioned my intelligence, my judgment, and even my personal worth. Closing the company felt like publicly admitting defeat, and shame followed me into everyday interactions. Conversations became uncomfortable because I imagined others silently judging my failure. Instead of reflecting honestly on what had gone wrong, I chose avoidance. I convinced myself that the safest response was to never risk failure again. Believing protection from disappointment was wiser than ambition. Yet life rarely allows important lessons to remain ignored forever. What I failed to understand then was that avoiding failure does not prevent growth from demanding attention. It only postpones the moment when reality insists that we learn what we were meant to understand all along. 2 years later, confidence slowly began to return, almost cautiously, as though testing whether it was safe to appear again. Time has a quiet way of softening painful memories, and gradually the sharp emotional weight of my first failure faded into something more distant. I convinced myself that I had grown wiser simply because enough time had passed. The discomfort was no longer as vivid, and I interpreted that emotional distance as personal growth. Believing I had learned my lesson, I decided to try again and started another venture, fully convinced that this attempt would lead to a different outcome. On the surface, everything truly seemed different. I entered a new industry, developed what I believed was a stronger strategy, and approached decisions with greater caution. I spoke more carefully, planned more thoroughly, and reassured myself that experience alone had transformed me. From the outside, it looked like progress. However, beneath these visible changes, something essential remained untouched. I was still deeply afraid of asking for help. Admitting uncertainty felt like exposing weakness, and I continued believing that competence meant always having answers rather than seeking them. This hidden fear influenced my decisions far more than I understood at the time. I chose to work alone, even when collaboration would have strengthened the project. I dismissed advice that challenged my assumptions because it threatened my sense of control. Instead of slowing down to reflect or learn from others, I pushed forward relentlessly, mistaking speed for progress. My determination, which once felt admirable, quietly became stubbornness disguised as confidence. Gradually, familiar problems began reappearing, almost as if life were replaying an old story. Deadlines slipped despite long hours of work. Stress accumulated until it became a constant background presence. Communication with partners grew tense, strained by misunderstandings and unspoken frustrations. Although the circumstances looked different from my previous experience, the emotional pattern felt strangely familiar. Eventually, history repeated itself, and the business failed once again. The second failure hurt more deeply than the first because it revealed something far more unsettling than bad luck. Sitting alone in my car one evening, after closing everything down, I felt overwhelmed by confusion and exhaustion. I kept asking myself why this kept happening, why effort and determination never seemed enough to change the outcome. The question echoed repeatedly in my mind, searching for external explanations. Only much later did I understand that the real question was never why failure appeared in my life, but what lesson I continued refusing to learn. Failure was not pursuing me or standing in my way. Instead, through unconscious habits and unchanged thinking, I was unknowingly recreating the very circumstances I feared most. The problem was not the opportunity, the market, or even timing. The problem was that while my environment had changed, my mindset had remained the same, quietly guiding me back to the same result again and again. The third major setback arrived quietly, without warning or dramatic collapse. Yet, its impact was decisive and impossible to ignore. By that point in my life, failure no longer felt accidental or unfortunate. It no longer seemed like bad timing or external misfortune. Instead, it carried a sense of predictability, almost inevitability, as though I had been walking toward it without fully realizing where the path was leading. This time, the consequences extended far beyond financial loss or professional reputation. What I lost felt far more personal and difficult to rebuild. I lost trust, the confidence of collaborators who had once believed in my vision, the encouragement of friends who had supported my ambitions, and most painfully, my own belief in myself. Exhaustion replaced defensiveness. I no longer had the energy to blame circumstances, market conditions, or unlucky timing. Something within me finally shifted, allowing honest self-examination to begin. I started looking closely at my own patterns instead of searching for external explanations. Gradually, I recognized a painful truth. I had been chasing visible success without developing inner stability. My focus had always been on outcomes, growth, recognition, achievement, while neglecting the mindset required to sustain them. I moved forward constantly, driven by urgency, yet rarely paused to reflect on whether I was improving in meaningful ways. I had spent years trying to appear confident rather than investing the time and humility required to become genuinely capable. This realization was deeply uncomfortable because it dismantled the story I had told myself for years. Yet it was also transformative. I began to understand that repeated failure was not punishment or evidence of inadequacy. It was feedback patiently offered by life itself. The same lesson had appeared again and again in different forms, waiting for me to notice what I had previously refused to see. Failure was not blocking my progress, it was guiding it. So, for the first time, I slowed down intentionally. Instead of rushing into another project to prove my worth, I chose learning over validation. I enrolled in courses that strengthened my weaknesses, searched for mentors who possessed experience I lacked, and asked questions I once avoided because they exposed gaps in my knowledge. Slowly, humility replaced pride. Admitting uncertainty no longer felt threatening. It felt necessary. Through this period, I learned discipline, the ability to show up consistently, even on days when motivation disappeared. I learned patience, allowing progress to unfold gradually rather than demanding immediate results. Most importantly, I developed emotional resilience. Fear did not vanish, but I learned to acknowledge it without allowing it to dictate my decisions. For the first time, growth no longer depended on external achievements or recognition. It became internal, steady, and deeply rooted, shaping not just what I accomplished, but who I was becoming along the way. Years passed, and eventually I found the courage to begin again. Though this time the experience felt profoundly different from anything I had attempted before. The work itself was not easier, nor did challenges suddenly disappear. Difficulties continued to arise with familiar persistence, unexpected problems, demanding decisions, moments of uncertainty that tested both patience and confidence. What had truly changed was not the environment around me, but my relationship with difficulty itself. I no longer viewed obstacles as personal threats or evidence that I was incapable. Instead, they became natural elements of growth, experiences meant to be understood rather than feared. Mistakes no longer shook my sense of identity. In the past, every error felt like proof that I did not belong or was unqualified to succeed. Now, mistakes simply indicated areas that required adjustment. Feedback, once uncomfortable and difficult to accept, gradually transformed into valuable guidance. Criticism stopped feeling like rejection and began functioning as direction. Problems that would once have discouraged me became opportunities to pause, reassess, and refine my approach rather than signals telling me to give up entirely. The business I built during this period did not achieve instant success or dramatic recognition. There were no sudden breakthroughs or overnight victories. Growth happened slowly, almost quietly, supported by stronger foundations and clearer thinking developed through years of reflection. Progress felt stable and sustainable rather than fragile and uncertain. Each small improvement carried deeper satisfaction because it was built upon understanding rather than urgency. One evening, while walking home after an entirely ordinary workday, I experienced a realization that felt both simple and profound. Success had not arrived because failure had disappeared from my life. Challenges were still present, and mistakes still occurred. The difference was that I had finally learned how to learn from failure instead of running from it. I understood that progress depended not on avoiding difficulty, but on engaging with it honestly. Looking back now, I recognize that those difficult years were never wasted. What once appeared to be lost time was, in truth, preparation. Every setback developed patience, humility, and clarity, qualities that success alone could never have taught me. Failure reshaped my understanding of achievement by revealing weaknesses I needed to confront, while also uncovering strengths I never knew I possessed. Experiences that once felt like evidence of incapacity were actually forms of training, quietly building resilience, awareness, and emotional maturity today. When people ask how I eventually succeeded, I rarely speak about strategies, timing, or opportunity. Instead, I explain that growth truly began the moment I stopped fearing failure and started listening to what it was trying to teach me. Failure was never the opposite of success. It was the path leading toward understanding. Now, when challenges appear, I no longer interpret them as signs that something is wrong. I see them as reminders that learning continues, that growth is still unfolding, and that becoming the person I was meant to be has always been a gradual and ongoing process. The years when everything seemed to fall apart were, in reality, the years when everything quietly began coming together. And now, as this story comes to an end, perhaps you realize something quietly important. Failure was never meant to stop us. It was meant to shape us. Every mistake, every disappointment, every difficult moment carries a lesson waiting to be understood. And sometimes, the paths that seem broken are actually guiding us toward a stronger version of ourselves. If this story helped you relax, reflect, or understand English a little more naturally, take a moment to continue your learning journey with us. Listen again tomorrow, because fluency does not come from pressure. It grows through consistency, patience, and meaningful listening. Thank you for spending this time here, and remember, your story is still unfolding. See you in the next story.